My daughter was locked out of her own kitchen at 6:15 in the morning. When I pulled into that driveway, she was sitting on the front step in her bathrobe, barefoot on the cold brick, holding my 6-year-old grandson against her chest while he slept through the whole thing. A moving truck she hadn't ordered was idling at the curb, and 2 men in matching polo shirts were already carrying her husband's recliner out the front door. She wasn't crying. She was just watching them do it, the way you watch weather happen to somebody else's house. That's the part that stayed lodged in me, not the truck, not the men, not even the locks. It was the stillness in her face. I'd seen that same stillness in her mother the year before she died, and it scared me more than any amount of screaming would have. She didn't see me at first. I sat in my truck at the end of the block for almost a full minute before I could make myself walk up that path, because I already knew what was in that house, and I knew she didn't. I'd known for the better part of a year. I'd built a quiet, careful thing in the dark to meet exactly this morning, and no amount of planning prepares a father for the sight of his own daughter thrown out onto her own lawn with a sleeping child in her arms. She had no idea I'd been standing there. No idea I'd been waiting on this exact sunrise for 11 months. And the man responsible for those moving boxes had no idea that he'd just detonated the last trap in a plan I'd been laying since the spring. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 66 years old, a retired boiler inspector out of Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I raised my daughter Grace by myself after her mother, Ruth, passed from a stroke when Grace was 14. I tell you that first because it explains the two of us. We're not loud people. We're the kind who fix the thing quietly before anybody notices it was broken. Grace grew up steady and careful, the sort of woman who color codes her calendar and still sends handwritten birthday cards to people who've forgotten her own birthday twice. She worked as a physical therapist at a clinic outside town, on her feet 10 hours a day, helping strangers learn to walk again after knee surgeries and strokes, for a wage that never once matched what she gave people. If you want to know what somebody's made of, look at what they're willing to do for less than they're worth. She didn't marry into money, looking for money. She married a man named Preston Cole because he made her laugh at her own jokes, and because he remembered, 3 weeks after she mentioned it once in passing, that her favorite flower was ranunculus, and showed up with a bouquet of them for no reason at all. I believe she loved him. I still believe that. And I need you to understand something before this story goes where it's going. Preston is not the villain here. Keep hold of that, because it matters later, more than you'd expect. Preston's father is a man named Everett Cole, and if you've spent any time in Lackawanna County, you already know that name. He owns the mall off Route 6, 3 self-storage complexes, and a construction outfit that's poured half the new driveways in 3 townships. He's the kind of man who calls the mayor by his first name and doesn't wait for the mayor to call him back. He walks into a room, already assuming it belongs to him. I shook his hand exactly once, at Thanksgiving 4 years ago, and I knew inside 30 seconds that this was the most dangerous thing about him. A man who's never once been told no eventually forgets the word exists. Preston brought him to my house that Thanksgiving, along with Everett's second wife, a quiet woman named Diane who spent most of the meal watching her plate. Everett walked through my living room the way a man walks through a property he's already decided he'll be buying cheap someday. He didn't say a single unkind word. He didn't need to. He picked up a photo of Ruth off my mantel, looked at it a half-second too long, and said, "Modest little place. Comfortable, I'm sure." Like he'd reached up onto a shelf for the smallest word he could find. I poured him coffee and smiled and watched him for the rest of the night. By the time his car pulled out of my driveway, I had the whole man sketched out in my head, and I did not like the drawing. Here's my honest confession, and you'd have done the same. If that were your child bringing somebody like that to your table, you'd have felt that same cold drop behind your ribs, the one you get when a stranger looks at your life and quietly puts a price tag on it. I said nothing. A young couple's happiness deserves a clean runway before anybody starts pointing at the cracks in it. So I filed it away. That's what I've always done. I file things away and I wait. They married the following June at a country club Everett owned a piece of. 240 guests, a band flown in from Philadelphia, an open bar that ran until 2 in the morning. Everett gave a toast that was really a speech about Everett, about the standards he'd built his family on, about what it meant to marry into the Cole name, about responsibility. He said the word responsibility 3 separate times, and each time it sounded a little less like a blessing and a little more like the fine print on a lease nobody had bothered reading aloud. Everyone laughed at the right moments. Preston laughed too. I didn't. I drove home, turning that word over and over in my hands, and when I got to my driveway, I sat in the dark a long while before I went inside and wrote the date down in a notebook. That notebook became something I kept for the better part of a year. My grandson arrived 19 months into that marriage. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, a shock of black hair, and Preston's exact crooked smile stamped right onto him. Grace called me from the hospital at 3 in the morning, and her voice had a crack in it I'd never once heard from her, wide open and brand new. "Dad," she said, "he's here. He's got 10 fingers and 10 toes, and he's already got an opinion about everything, I swear it." She named him Elliot. I drove out through the dark that same night and stood at the nursery glass for a long time, just looking at him. And something settled into my daughter the day Elliot came into the world, the way ballast finally settles into a ship's hull and lets it ride level in rough water. She'd always been steady. Now she was anchored to something bigger than herself. She read to that boy every single night without fail. She learned to braid hair on a doll so she'd be ready when he had a little sister someday. She was his mother in every single way that has ever counted, and I need you to hold on to that phrase, because we're coming back to it. The trouble never arrives all in one piece. It never does. It shows up in small, unconnected fragments that only turn into a picture once you finally lay them side by side on the same table. About a year into the marriage, Grace mentioned that Everett had offered Preston a position running client relations for the storage company, not managing anything, exactly, more being a friendly face at ribbon cuttings and county commissioner dinners. "Dad, it's double what I make," Preston told me himself, sitting at my own kitchen table, looking almost apologetic about it. I asked him what Grace thought. He said she thought he should take it. I asked what he thought. He said he figured it couldn't hurt. He started 2 months later. I visited his new office once, up on the second floor of Everett's headquarters building, all glass and dark wood that looked borrowed rather than earned. Preston wore a blazer that didn't sit right on him yet, like a boy in his father's church clothes. He was proud, and I was proud of him for being proud, and underneath all of that I was sick with worry about everything he'd quietly set down in order to stand in that room. Because here's what 66 years has taught me. When a powerful man hands you something for nothing, he isn't giving you a gift. He's installing a lever, and one day, when it suits him, he's going to pull it. It was my neighbor Dale who first pointed me down the road I hadn't thought to walk. Dale spent almost 30 years doing family law 2 towns over. He's not my attorney. He's just the man I've shared a property line and 1,000 Saturday morning coffees with since before Grace could ride a bike. One evening on my back porch, thinking out loud, not accusing a soul of anything, I mentioned the new house Preston and Grace had moved into that spring, the one Everett had called a wedding gift. Dale went quiet for a while. Then he asked, "Is Preston's name actually on that deed, or is he just living in it?" I didn't know. I called Grace that night, casual as anything, and asked. She didn't know either Everett had handled all the paperwork so they wouldn't have to worry about it. That was the night I started keeping real notes instead of just dates. I want to stop and speak to you plainly for a second, because I think some of you already know this feeling. If you've ever sat across the table from somebody you love and watched them walk smiling into a trap, and known that saying so out loud would only make them defend the person who built it, then you already understand the specific kind of lonely I'm describing. You see the whole shape of the thing. You can't say it yet, so you carry it by yourself. I carried it for months. Then, about 7 months into that notebook, Preston's stepmother Diane came to my house alone. That had never once happened before. I made her tea, and she sat at my kitchen table a long while before she said a word. "Harold," she finally said, "I need you to know I care about Grace, and I love that little boy like he's my own blood." I told her I believed her. "Everett has ideas," she said, "about how a family like his is supposed to look, about what's owed to him. And sometimes his ideas and Preston's aren't the same thing at all." I asked what kind of ideas. She looked up at me, and what I saw in her face was a woman standing at a fork in a road she never chose and wasn't sure she'd ever been allowed to walk away from. "He thinks Preston married down," she said quietly. "He doesn't say it that way, but that's what he means." She finished her tea and left 20 minutes later, and she hugged me at the door longer than she ever had before. I stood in my kitchen a long while after that door shut. Then I called Dale, and I did something I never imagined I'd do in my life. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Marisol Vega. Dale vouched for her, said she was thorough and quiet and didn't scare easy. I asked her to trace the actual paper trail underneath Preston and Grace's whole life. What she came back with went so far past anything I'd braced for that I read her report twice standing in my own driveway. The house, a stone colonial on a cul-de-sac I'd always assumed they'd bought together, belonged entirely to a holding company Everett controlled through 3 layers of paperwork. Preston's name wasn't on that deed. It never had been. Everett had called it a wedding gift and simply never transferred a single thing. Preston's salary ran through a shell entity, not the real company, which meant Everett could end the arrangement any morning he pleased, with none of the protections a real job would carry. And the prenuptial agreement Grace had signed with an attorney Everett had personally recommended, calling it just a formality between family, was written in language that lawyer had called standard at the time, but that Dale, reading it fresh 3 years later, called about as one-sided as he'd seen in his whole career. I read that prenup twice at my own kitchen table on a rainy Tuesday. Then I sat back and thought about the word modest and how carefully Everett had chosen it. Now I have to tell you the part that changed everything. Not the house, not the job. This is the part that kept me up at 4 in the morning and turned everything I did after it into something cold and exact and precise. In the course of her digging, Marisol had spoken to a woman who'd once worked the front desk at the fertility clinic. Grace and Preston had quietly visited 2 years into their marriage, back when they were struggling to have a second child. The woman was long gone from that office and owed nobody anything. She told Marisol that, during one difficult visit, Grace, worn thin and scared, and talking more than she meant to in a waiting room, had confided that Everett had once offered her money, real money, a number with commas in it, if she'd simply agree to a postnuptial arrangement that would keep the house and every asset entirely in Cole family hands regardless of what happened to the marriage. Grace had refused him outright and never told Preston a word of it, because she didn't want to be the reason there was a rift between father and son. I sat with that for 3 days, doing nothing but holding it. Not confronting anybody, just holding it, the way you hold something too hot to set down and too important to drop. Then I built a plan, quiet and careful, the way I've built everything worth building in my life. I told Preston I wanted to get the family's paperwork in order, nothing dramatic, just a man my age thinking about wills and beneficiaries and making sure Elliot was taken care of no matter what. I asked him, easy as anything, whether the house deed and his employment records were somewhere I could help him organize, since Grace was always working double shifts and I had nothing but time. He thought it was a sweet, harmless thing for an old man to want to do. He had no idea I was quietly having Dale cross-reference every document that came out of that request against what Marisol had already found. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I think I owe you that. Nothing. I made no call. I gave no sign. I sat on the heaviest information I'd ever held in my hands, and instead of reaching for a lawyer that same week, I thought about a 6-year-old boy who called me Pop Pop, who slept with a nightlight shaped like a dump truck, and who was afraid of the vacuum cleaner. I thought about what he needed, and then I started building in earnest. I spent the next 8 months in slow, deliberate preparation. Dale helped me find Preston and Grace, a real attorney out of Wilkes-Barre, a sharp, unhurried woman named Renata Ford, with no ties whatsoever to the Cole family or the firms they usually used. I paid her retainer myself, out of money I'd been quietly setting aside since Ruth passed, money I'd always meant for Grace anyway. We documented everything, the deed, the shell company, the prenup, and exactly where each one collided with Pennsylvania case law. Marisol kept digging and found 2 former Cole employees who'd been pushed out of the company in almost the exact same fashion Preston was about to be. I called one of them myself, a man named Otis, who'd managed 2 of Everett's storage properties for 11 years. What he told me, I wrote down and kept. He doesn't fire you outright. He just arranges things until walking away feels like your own idea. Then he tells everybody you quit. There's never a single thing on paper to say otherwise. I looked at my legal pad after that call and thought about my son-in-law sitting in his borrowed office, in his borrowed house, holding a borrowed title, and something in me went very still and very certain. I didn't tell Preston or Grace any of it yet. Not because I didn't trust either of them, because I did know them, both of them, well enough to know exactly what would happen if I said it too soon. Preston would confront his father within the hour, out of raw feeling instead of strength, and hand Everett's lawyers all the time in the world to prepare a polished answer before supper. I'd watched that man operate for 4 years. He was never once caught without a position ready to defend. I needed him caught with nothing ready at all, so I waited. And waiting, when you can already see the blade coming for people you love, is the hardest kind of labor there is. That morning came on a Tuesday in September. Grace called me at 6:30, and her voice was flat in the particular way a voice goes when a person is holding themselves together purely through will. Dad, he changed the locks. Preston's key card didn't work at the office yesterday, and this morning our garage code doesn't work either. There's a moving truck in the driveway. Diane texted me an hour ago and said Everett decided it was time she said, stood on our own. She stopped. Elliot's still asleep. I've got him right here with me. Dad, I don't understand what's happening. I closed my eyes for 2 full seconds. Is Elliot safe, right now, in your arms? I asked. Yes. Good, I said. Listen to me carefully. Call Renata Ford right now. Her number's the one saved under R in your phone. I put it there 7 months ago. A long silence. Dad, why is there a lawyer's number in my phone I've never heard of? Call her, I said. Then come to my house. Bring Elliot. I'll explain everything, all of it, the second you walk through my door. Another silence, longer this time. And then, very quietly. You knew. Dad, you knew this was coming. Come home, I told her. That's all I let myself say. She sat at my kitchen table for a long while after she arrived, Elliot finally asleep on the couch under an old quilt of Ruth's. I put coffee in front of her and let her be quiet for as long as she needed to be. Then I sat across from her and started at the very beginning. I told her everything. The notebook, Marisol's findings, the deed, the shell company, the prenup, and what it actually said underneath all that formal language. I laid the folders out one at a time and let her read every page. When I reached the fertility clinic, I stopped. There's one more thing, I said, and I need you to hear the whole of it before you say anything back to me. She looked at me, and something in her face had already gone very still, the way it does, right before a person braces for a wave. They can see building from a long way off. I told her gently, as I knew how what the woman at that front desk had told Marisol about the offer Everett had made her, the money, the postnuptial arrangement she'd turned down and never once mentioned to her own husband, out of loyalty to a marriage she was trying to protect. Grace put both hands flat on the table, like she needed something solid under them. He offered me money to protect himself from my own marriage, she said. It wasn't a question. Before you'd even had Elliot, I told her. Before any of this. She looked up at me, and I have never in my life wanted to take somebody's pain into my own chest the way I wanted to take hers in that moment. And I said no, she said, quiet and disbelieving, like she was hearing the shape of her own younger self's courage for the first time from the outside. You said no, I told her, and you never once used it against Preston, or against Everett, or as leverage for yourself. You just carried it. That's who you've always been. She pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once, silently. I didn't reach for her, and I didn't feel the quiet, because some grief has to be allowed to land all the way before a person can stand back up under it. The clock over my stove ticked. The coffee went cold between us. Time stretched the way it does at a graveside, where 1 minute holds the weight of an hour. Then, slowly, she lowered her hands. Her eyes were red and wet and entirely clear. What do we do? She said. It wasn't really a question either. We already started, I told her. Renata Ford filed the first documents that Friday morning. The heart of it was simple, even though the work behind it wasn't. The holding company's failure to ever formally transfer the house created enforceable rights under Pennsylvania law, a promise made, relied upon, and lived inside for 3 years. The shell company pay structure, with no genuine employment contract behind it, gave Preston a strong claim for unpaid and misrepresented compensation. And the prenup, reviewed fresh by an attorney with no ties to the Cole family, had been signed under conditions that raised serious questions, since the original attorney had a 15-year professional relationship with Everett that had never once been disclosed to Grace. Everett's lawyers responded within 72 hours. They were sharp. They were fast. They'd clearly braced for some version of this fight. What they had not braced for was its scope. Marisol had spent nearly a year being thorough. Otis came forward with his own paper trail, kept in a fireproof lockbox in his basement, and his termination lined up with Preston's so closely it established an unmistakable pattern. A second former employee, a woman named Bridget, had records of her own to add to it. And then there was what Diane did. I won't speak unkindly of her. She'd spent decades married to a man who never once let her make a decision that didn't ultimately serve him first. But once she understood the full weight of what had been done to Preston, to Grace, to their marriage, to a 6-year-old boy who deserved better than being a pawn in somebody's estate planning, she made a choice that I believe cost her more than most people watching this will ever fully understand. She called Renata Ford's office herself, unprompted, and handed over internal financial records that confirmed every piece of the deed and shell company structure Marisol had already found. And she told them, on her own, about a private meeting she'd overheard years earlier where Everett openly discussed insulating the family's assets before Grace and Preston had even set a wedding date. Here's where I owe Everett Cole a moment of honesty, because I think it matters. I don't believe he woke up most mornings deciding to be cruel. I believe that somewhere in the deepest room of himself, he thought he was protecting something. He'd built an empire out of a single gravel truck and 40 years of stubbornness. And to a man built that way, money isn't comfort, it's a structure you defend with your whole life, the same way another man might defend a family name or a faith. He looked at Preston's marriage to a physical therapist's daughter from a house on a working street and saw, genuinely saw, a weak beam in a building he'd spent 4 decades reinforcing. He thought quietly walling it off was kinder than open war. He thought he was being a faithful steward of everything he'd built. That is the tragedy of men like Everett. They confuse control with love so completely, and for so many years, that by the time they're old they can no longer tell the two apart, and everyone standing close to them pays the structural cost of that confusion. Understanding that didn't make me forgive him, but it made everything that came after feel less like revenge, and more like a building finally being inspected by an engineer. It couldn't intimidate. The settlement took a little over 4 months. I won't lay out every clause of it, since parts of it remain sealed and most of it wouldn't matter to you anyway. What matters is the outcome. The house was formally transferred into both Preston and Grace's names, jointly, for good. The very legal machinery Everett had assumed would always shield him, instead enforced the promise that house had always represented. The unpaid compensation claims were settled in full, with interest, legal fees included. The prenuptial agreement was thrown out entirely by the court, on the grounds of both non-disclosure and undue influence. Everett never saw the inside of a courtroom in handcuffs, and I want to be straight with you about that, because I know some of you are hoping for that ending. What he did was structured just carefully enough to stay on the civil side of the line, and I'm not naive about what money and 40 years of careful lawyering can buy in that regard. But 2 of his largest commercial partners, once the pattern laid out in those proceedings became public record, quietly stopped returning his calls. A land deal he'd been chasing for almost 3 years fell apart in financing within a month. The name that used to open every door in 3 townships stopped opening quite so many of them. I'll take that. I'll take that every single day of the week. This is the part of the story I think you actually came here for, more than the ending itself. This whole ordeal taught me that the most dangerous people in a family rarely raise their voice. They smile, they hand out gifts wrapped in kindness. They build a cage one comfortable bar at a time, and by the time you notice you're standing inside it, the door's already been closed behind you for years. Most people make the mistake of believing that generosity always comes without a hook attached to it. It doesn't, not always. And the thing Diane understood, in the end, better than anyone else left standing in that family, was that protecting a child sometimes requires betraying the very person who shaped your whole life. So here is something you can actually go do today, and I mean today, not someday. If somebody has handed you a house, a job, a future, go put your own name on the paperwork. Read the deed. Read every page of the contract, especially the parts your eyes want to skip. Love and a signature are not the same thing, and the people who tell you not to worry about the difference between them are usually the ones counting on the fact that you never will. And here's a question I'd like you to sit with after you finish listening to this. If everything you had right now were quietly sitting in somebody else's name, how free do you actually think you'd be? Elliot turns 7 this coming January. We're having his party right here at my place, because Preston and Grace are staying with me for a while as they get their footing back under them, not out of need anymore, just out of a family finally choosing to be close on purpose instead of by accident. He wants a fire truck theme this year, so I spent last Saturday afternoon letting a 6-year-old strap a plastic fire helmet onto my head while I sat out on the back porch in the cold and let him hose me down with an imaginary fire hose for 20 straight minutes. He thought this was the single funniest thing that had ever happened in the recorded history of the world. Preston stood in the doorway watching the 2 of us, working through something that wasn't quite grief anymore, more like the slow, honest labor of learning to trust a life he'd once handed over too easily to somebody else's name. He's doing that work honestly. He drives Elliot to school most mornings now. He reads to him at night on the weeks it's his turn. He has not faltered, not once, not one single day since that Tuesday in September. People sometimes ask me if I feel any guilt for letting my daughter walk through those months not knowing what I already knew. I don't have a clean answer for that. What I do know is that if I'd told her the moment I found out, she'd have confronted Everett straight out of raw feeling instead of out of strength, and she'd have ended up cut off with no real way out and no proof behind her. What I built instead took time and silence and every ounce of discipline I had to hold a plan steady while every instinct in me was screaming to act right then. Was it right, keeping my own daughter in the dark that long? I still don't fully know. What I do know is that it was necessary. Before I let you go tonight, I want to hear from you, because I read every single comment you leave me, and honestly, that's most of why I keep telling these stories at all. Tell me straight, do you think I was right to carry that weight alone while I built all of this in silence? Put a 1 in the comments if you think I did right by him, protecting him quietly instead of blowing it all up the moment I knew. Put a 2 if you think a parent owes their child the truth the second they learn it, no matter what it costs. And put a 3 if you're somewhere in between and still turning it over in your own head, same as I still do some nights. And while you're down there, tell me whereabouts you're watching from tonight, and what time it is on your end of things. I love seeing just how far these stories travel once the lights go down. And if you've ever had somebody with money or standing look straight through you and decide your whole life was theirs to quietly rearrange, tell me about it in your own words. You are not nearly as alone in that feeling as it seems in the middle of the night. If this one moved you even a little, do an old man a small kindness and subscribe before you go. It's just me back here, and a handful of good people who care about stories like this one, and every single one of you keeps this little corner of the internet alive. Stay a while longer if you can. There are more of these coming, and I'd like you here for them.